I just heard about this a couple, I don't know, maybe about a month ago when the Titanic submersible thing happened. And just all the conversation about it and the memes got me wanting to watch the James Cameron Titanic movie. On Amazon Prime, and when you type in Titanic, the first result is obviously the movie, but the second result was this like 50-minute long documentary, and I was just more in the mood to watch that, so clicked on that going into it blind, not really knowing what the topic of the video was. But it blew my mind, and it's my new favorite conspiracy, and that is this Titanic conspiracy theory that there was actually an insurance fraud scheme, and the ship that's at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean right now is not the Titanic. It's actually another White Star Line ship called the Olympic. This one had me sold. So I'm going to show you some clips from the documentary that I watched on Amazon Prime about this. I believe it's called Why the Titanic Sank. I'm going to show you one of the claims they make in the video and what they say to support it. And then I found a website that fact checks this entire conspiracy theory and says that if anybody believes it, like, you're an idiot. So they go through all of the claims and offer the official debunking of it, and I will read it to you and explain how these fact checks and debunkings don't make any sense at all. So I don't know for sure if the ship at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean is the Olympic or not. After hearing all of this information, it makes a lot of sense, but it could also be the Titanic. I have no idea. I will never go down to the Atlantic Ocean to check for myself. But here is how I sift through information to determine which side I think is more likely telling the truth. So this first clip that I'll show you just starts off with the host of the documentary explaining the basic premises of the theory. Basically, it's that there's these two twin ships, the Titanic and the Olympic. They look exactly the same. The Olympic gets damaged in an accident and insurance won't pay out on it. So at the last minute, the White Star Line switched the damaged ship and the brand new Titanic so they could intentionally sink the damaged ship in the ocean and collect the insurance money that way. And I know a lot of people, when I first tell them this, because I think I've told every single person I've talked to since I watched the documentary about this, a lot of people are like, oh, I can't believe they would kill all those people for an insurance fraud switch. And not to get too ahead of myself on the theory, but they didn't. The people were not supposed to die. Their plan went awry, so to speak. And that's all covered in these clips too.
The Titanic and the Olympic were built for the White Star Line by Belfast shipbuilders Harland and Wolff, whose chairman was Lord Pirrie. Harland and Wolff built ships almost exclusively for the White Star Line, which was acquired in 1903 by American financier J. Pierpont Morgan's International Mercantile Marine. This was part of a drive to create a monopoly on the lucrative North Atlantic passenger trade. The first of the new ships, Olympic and Titanic, were to be virtually identical. This represented the White Star Line's survival strategy in the highly competitive North Atlantic passenger market, while also ensuring a bright future for the Harland and Wolff shipyard. On the 14th of June 1911, the Olympic made her maiden voyage under the command of Captain Edward J. Smith, Commodore of the White Star Line. Then just a week later, still under the command of Edward Smith, the Olympic was involved in a stern collision with the tug O.L. Hallenbeck in New York, an accident that nearly caused the tug to sink. Barely 3 months later, on the 20th of September 1911, the Olympic, still under the command of Captain Smith, was involved in yet another collision, this time with the British warship HMS Hawke in the Brambles Channel in Southampton water. It was a serious collision, which was to seal the fate of the Olympic. Pulled in by the suction from the Olympic's great propellers, the Hawke is irresistibly drawn towards the larger vessel, and the two ships collide. The Hawke's underwater ram and bows strike and penetrate the starboard side of the Olympic, causing a triangular hole several meters high, and an even larger hole below the waterline. Any accident involving a Royal Naval ship was investigated by the Admiralty, who, not surprisingly in this case, found that the Olympic was at fault, even though the evidence, including eyewitness accounts, suggested otherwise. As a consequence of this ruling, the White Star's insurers declined to pay out on the claim.
So the fact checkers say that the damage from the Olympic's collision with Hawke was more significant. That's the claim, and the fact check debunkers say the Olympic was damaged badly enough to force the voyage to be canceled. 2 major watertight compartments were flooded, her hull plating was gashed, the starboard propeller shafting damaged. Photos after the collision show the liner down at the stern. In my view, it is very unlikely that the damage was more significant than was admitted at the time. Well, my argument back to this is you don't need to embellish the significance of that. That is a giant gaping hole in the side of that ship. Just the damage that the fact checkers agree that has happened. The propeller shaft is damaged, which will come into play a little bit later, and 2 major compartments are flooded. Like I said, that huge hole in the stern of the ship. To me, it doesn't seem that you need to embellish the damage to it. You can just, everybody can agree that that is the amount of damage done, and it is significant. The other thing that the conspiracy theorists will say is that the Olympic survived too long for a ship that was damaged as bad as it was. So it says, how can a ship with a bent keel go on to serve for 24 years without being fully repaired? And according to the fact checkers, it says you have to assume that the Olympic's keel was damaged, for which there's no evidence of. Other than this photo right here that we have of a huge hole in the side of the ship. So, pretty good evidence, if you ask me, that that ship's probably effed up. But conspiracy theorists are just assuming that, apparently based on nothing. Both of these ships had like a slight tilt to port. I don't know boat talks. I don't know if boat or port is left or right. But after the Olympic gets hit, it now tilts to the side like 20 degrees, or 2 degrees, sorry, 2 degrees. The Titanic, which was a brand new ship that had never set sail before, the passengers on that ship also just coincidentally noticed that that ship also tilted 2 degrees to port side too.
The damage done to the Olympic was severe. Besides being holed both above and below the waterline, she sustained numerous other injuries, including steel frames buckled, thousands of rivets popped, steel plating dislodged over 4 decks, and distortion to the starboard propeller and crankshaft. To make matters worse, the keel was bent, giving the ship a pronounced list to port. Interestingly enough, when 6 months later the ship which came to be known as the Titanic made her maiden voyage out of Southampton, second-class passenger Lawrence Beasley, a science teacher, noted that the ship seemed to have a slight but permanent list to port on the first part of the voyage, a fact noted by several other surviving passengers. The great hull was patched up in Southampton by riveting steel plates below the waterline and reinforcing with wooden beams above. This work took over 2 weeks, suggesting just how serious the damage was.
So the fact checkers acknowledge that, yes, it is true that a list to port was observed by the passenger Lawrence Beasley and by somebody named Norman Chambers, and photos taken of the Titanic leaving Southampton also reveal a slight port list. It just says, however, that is not unusual, even for modern ships, and it can be due to several factors. In Titanic's case, it was likely due to improper ballasting. Too much on the port side or too little on the starboard. To use this as evidence that it was actually the Olympic is certainly jumping to an extreme conclusion, especially with such lack of supporting evidence. As in the previous points, we know that the damage to the Olympic did not include a warped keel. Well, we don't know that. The fact checkers just said it. They also didn't provide any evidence, so at best you can say it's a toss-up and it's unproven. But I'm not the one that's calling myself a fact checker and then declaring that just because I say something that it's true. I think that the huge hole in the side of the ship and the fact that afterwards the Olympic tilted 2 degrees to the side is pretty good evidence for somebody to think that it had a warped keel. I don't think you're basing that on lack of supporting evidence, and it's such an extreme conclusion to come to. Again, they're the fact checkers, and they don't know why the Titanic was tilted to the side when it was on its maiden voyage. They list a few reasons and say, oh, this is what it could be. Like, well, that's not fact checking then. That's just like casting doubt on something, which is a fair thing to do if you are somebody's defense attorney, but not if you are a self-proclaimed fact checker.
In order to get the Olympic back to sea and earning a profit as soon as possible, the starboard propeller, stamped with the Titanic's number 401 and not yet fitted to the Titanic, was fitted to the Olympic. This is a fact of some considerable significance, as we shall find out later.
Basically, the ships, the different parts of them when they were building in the shipyard, they have different numbers stamped on the parts to tell you what ship it belonged to. And the Olympic's number was 400, the Titanic's was 401. The conspiracy theorists say that when the Olympic was damaged in its accident, in order to get it up and running again so the company could be making profit while they were putting the finishing touches on the Titanic, they took one of the Titanic propellers that had not been attached to the Titanic yet, and they just put it on the Olympic. What the fact checkers say about this is the reality is that Olympic and Titanic had differently pitched propeller blades, so they would not have worked to their full potential had the blades been swapped from one ship to the other. There is no evidence that Harland and Wolff ever used one of Titanic's propellers or propeller blades on the Olympic. There's every reason to believe that they would have had a spare Olympic propeller in any case. So again, that is not a fact check, that is just an assumption. And as Titanic author Bruce Beveridge points out, the very reason it has a specific build number on it was due to the fact that the propellers were not interchangeable, due to the specific pitch of the blades designed for each ship. If they were interchangeable, why would there be a number on it? The number proves that 1, the propellers could and would not be swapped, and 2, that the ship at the bottom of the ocean is the Titanic. Not to get too far ahead here in the clips, but in the wreckage at the bottom of the ocean, the propeller that's down there, it has the number 401 on it, so everybody's like, oh, it's a Titanic. Well, the conspiracy theorists are like, nah, that actually proves it's the Olympic because they switched the blade, or the propeller blades, to get the Olympic up and working again. So it actually totally fits in with what their theory is for the propeller at the bottom of the ocean to have the Titanic's number on it. In their mind, that is more evidence that it's actually the Olympic. So what the fact checkers are saying to this is that they only put those numbers on it if the item was specific to a certain ship. So you don't need to put a number on something if it's interchangeable. So the reason it had those numbers is because they were not interchangeable. So we are going to come back to that rationale here in a couple of minutes. I just wanted to point it out that that is the rationale that they are using here on the propeller fact check, and that's what those numbers mean, that it would only be on parts that are not interchangeable. It also does acknowledge here that it would work on a different ship, it just wouldn't work to its full potential. And I would say that if I were the masterminds behind the insurance fraud scheme, I wouldn't really care if the boat that we are intending to sink in the bottom of the ocean is working to its full potential or not. So if we need to patch it up in a hurry and your justification means, well, it's not going to work till its full potential if we do it rushed like that, then I'd say, who cares? It's getting sunk on its next trip anyways, so patch it up.
In Belfast, the Titanic and the Olympic were most often berthed side by side and were regularly moved in and out of the Thompson dry dock, especially during repairs to the Olympic. On close examination of contemporary archive photographs, it is possible to see the minor differences in design that tell the two ships apart. On the forward part of Sea Deck, Olympic was built with 16 portholes. The Titanic with 14. Somewhat mysteriously, the Titanic has acquired 2 extra portholes between its launch and its maiden voyage. This clearly points to the possibility that the two ships were switched. At the time of Titanic's launch, the windows on B deck are clearly discernible as being evenly spaced. Yet at the time of her maiden voyage, they have taken on a distinctly uneven appearance. And whereas the Olympic had been open to the public for inspection in Belfast and Liverpool, Titanic was not.
Conspiracy theorists say the Titanic had 14 bow portholes. The Olympic had 16 bow portholes. The ship photographed departing Southampton has 16 bow portholes, so it is the Olympic, not the Titanic. Fact checkers say this is one of the most popular pieces of evidence of a switch, but also the easiest to disprove. And then the fact checkers just go on to tell you that right before the Titanic launched on its maiden voyage, they just decided to switch the configuration and size of all of the windows. So here's a picture of the differences in the windows. And the conspiracy theorists point out that the starboard B-deck windows on the wreck at the bottom of the Atlantic, they're narrow, and that matches the design of the Olympic, not the Titanic. Also, at Titanic's launch, all of the windows on B-deck were evenly spaced out, yet on her maiden voyage, they were seen as being unevenly spaced, just as the Olympics were. So the photo that we have of the Titanic, when it was launched out, I guess at the sea trials or whatever they call it, that is where you see the windows that are evenly spaced out. And then by April, when it goes on its maiden voyage, now they're matched exactly what the Olympics look like. This is a class example of a meme using demonstrably false information or incorrect images to promote the switch theory, as it can very easily be disproved when looking at documented photographs. First of all, here's the meme that accompanies this claim. At the top is a photo of the wreck at the bottom of the ocean. Second one down is that same photo enhanced, where you can see the unevenly spaced narrow windows. Then when you go down to the second one from the bottom, that's a picture of what the Olympic looks like, which matches the wreck at the bottom of the ocean. And then the very bottom photograph is a picture of what the Titanic looks like, with wider, evenly spaced windows, not what you see the picture of the wreck. So this is the meme that they are telling you is false, what you're looking at. Even though I think they make a pretty valid point when you look at those pictures. It looks exactly like the Olympic. And the fact checkers acknowledge that the top picture, that is the correct picture of the wreck. That is what is at the bottom of the ocean. Nobody is disputing that that top picture is correct. So really the top 3 pictures then would be correct. It says, while the photograph of the wreck is correct, the image of the actual Titanic is not. It is the Olympic. And the Olympic is actually the Titanic. Now it says, let's examine an actual documented photograph of the Titanic. And they show you a picture of the Titanic that was taken on April 11th. So, when the Titanic launches. If you want to prove that the difference in configuration in the windows is just because they decided to change the design of the ship, then you should show a picture of the two ships side by side with the same window configuration. But they don't have that to show you because all of the pictures of the Titanic taken months before all show the different window configuration, which does not help their point at all. It contradicts what the fact checkers are saying. So the fact checkers are actually the ones that are using demonstrably false information, trying to mislead you by showing you a picture taken on April 11th and just saying, this is definitely the Titanic.
Only the names on the bows and sterns of the ships, the nameplates on the lifeboats, and 48 lifebelts would have to be swapped. This could easily have been achieved using a very small crew, literally over a weekend.
The next claim that the fact checkers want to address is that the conspiracy theorists say that all that needs to be done to switch the ships is exchange those parts of the ship which bore the vessel's name, such as nameplates, the ship's bell, menus, and notepaper letterheads, and the names on the lifebelts and the lifeboats, and also any plaques or brass fittings with the liner's name on it, and any interior signings bearing the ship's name. So the fact checkers say that this claim shows total ignorance, not only of Olympic and Titanic, but of ships and shipbuilding in general. The fact is that there are many physical differences between the two ships that would involve substantial work to change. They can't do it because there's so many physical differences, it can't be done. But in this next fact check, there is the claim that in all the advertisements of the Titanic, the White Star Line was actually using photographs and artwork of the Olympic. And that's what the conspiracy theorists say, and the fact checkers acknowledge that that is true. They say, indeed, much of the advertising, and for that matter, news coverage of the disaster, used artwork, photographs, and newsreel footage of the Olympic. What is blatantly omitted from this claim is that, of course, as Titanic had only just finished being fitted out and completed her sea trials and was on her maiden voyage, which only lasted 5 days, there was obviously not enough time to produce the required artwork and photographs of her. Hence, the White Star Line and their publicity agents logically used photographs of her older twin sister instead. It must be added that in 1912, it was not unusual to have inaccurate artist impressions and wrongly captioned photographs, but to claim that this was done deliberately to help with a switch is misleading, to say the least. And such a ploy would be mostly ineffective on people in 1912 who were largely unconcerned with such technical inaccuracy in promotional material. To the untrained eye, the exterior differences between the two ships were minor anyway, so it would have been deemed an unnecessary amount of extra work that would likely benefit very few. So in the fact check right before this, they say that there's many physical differences between these ships. You can't just switch them because a lot of differences. But in the next fact check, they just tell you that actually the ships are virtually identical and it's very easy to pass off photographs of one ship for the other because most people don't really care and aren't that really concerned with memorizing the technical differences between these two virtually identical ships anyways. So one of those two things could be true, but both of them can't be true. The fact that the fact checkers are trying to have it both ways shows that they are not fact checking anything. They are just trying to manipulate your opinion in a certain direction. In a separate fact check, they want to say that further proof that the ships were not switched is because when they finally took apart the Olympic, every piece of paneling and floorboard and just everything about this ship had the number 400 stamped on it, and so that means that it's definitely the Olympic. But if we go back to the previous fact check with the propeller, where they said that they only put the number on the parts that were not interchangeable, because if it was something that could be used on any ship, there would be no reason to differentiate it by putting a number on it. So it has to be one or the other. Either they only put the number on the ship-specific items, or they put it on every piece of paneling and floorboard that comprises the ship. So it's got to be one or the other, but the fact checkers contradict themselves and try to have it both ways. I'm always very skeptical when there's a fact checker who is just basically trying to cover all of their bases and ends up contradicting themselves, because then they're not fact checking anything, they're just covering for somebody. Another example of that comes to mind is like the Hillary Clinton Uranium One scandal, where the NPR fact checkers say that, yeah, she got $145 million donation to the Clinton Foundation from this company after she sold them 20% of U.S. uranium, but she recused herself from that decision. She let her underlings make the decision for her. But then, like, 2 paragraphs later, then they say that Hillary didn't even know that she was going to get $145 million. So it was that donation had nothing to do with it, and it was a total coincidence. So if Hillary didn't know that the donation was coming, then why did she recuse herself from the signing off on the sale? Like, I can understand why she would recuse herself if she knew that she had this donor relationship with the company, which, oh, by the way, she wasn't supposed to have those types of relationships if she was going to be Secretary of State, but we'll ignore that. But if she didn't know that the money was coming, then what was her reason at the time for saying, I'm just not going to be a part of that decision. I'm just going to let one of my deputies handle that one. Has anybody bothered to ask that question? Or are we just going to throw every single defense of Hillary Clinton at the wall and see what sticks? So here's where the conspiracy theory really starts to make its case, in my opinion. And this is the part about how the rescue went wrong. Now, these people on the ship were not supposed to die. It actually makes sense given the facts that we do know that aren't disputed, like how they were letting lifeboats go only half full for the vast majority of the sinking. Kind of seems like the actions of somebody that didn't think there was actually an emergency going on because they were expecting the rescue crew to come. Then once they realize, like, oh, that's not going to happen, and then they start loading up the boats, this theory actually does fit in with the behavior that we know happened that night. So this documentary does a very good job outlining how this was supposed to go down and then how it went wrong.
The coal strike is important for another, possibly more sinister reason. Most other ships were desperate for coal, and passengers and cargo destined for the New World were stuck in Europe. Yet, the Leyland liner Californian, under the command of Captain Stanley Lord, left the port of London on the 5th of April, 1912, just 5 days before Titanic's departure from Southampton, not only fully coaled, but apart from her own crew, empty of passengers. With more than enough coal to get her to the United States, she headed off into the middle of the Atlantic at full speed, empty. Apart from a cargo of woolen sweaters.
So this other ship called the Californian, it goes out to sea a few days before the Titanic and has nobody on their ship. They just have all these wool blankets and sweaters as though they were expecting to be rescuing people. And the fact checkers address this claim, and they say that while the Californian was primarily designed to transport cotton, there's absolutely no evidence that it had a cargo of a few thousand woolly jumpers and blankets. The reality is that the Californian's cargo manifest does not exist. To prove this claim, a manifest needs to be presented. And in the grand scheme of things, and the overwhelming evidence of switch did not take place, so this would prove very little anyways. What happened to the Californian's cargo manifesto. The fact checkers don't explain that. That's unusual for a cargo manifesto to not exist. Nobody disputes the fact that the Californian didn't have any passengers on it. Just, again, the fact checkers just throwing things out there without actually backing up what work they did or what evidence they have to deem their view, their opinion, their theory as the fact.
Captain Stanley Lord and the Californian had left the port of London in a great hurry, ostensibly bound for Boston. Then, On the evening of the 14th of April, the ship came to a dead stop in the middle of the ice field. Strangely, Captain Lord, 6 foot tall, elected to sleep that night fully clothed on a 5.5-foot couch in the chart room rather than in his cabin. He also ordered her boilers to be kept fired up and her engines on standby. Why? Was he expecting some sort of emergency that might mean a last-minute dash into the night? That evening, the Titanic received 6 radio messages. The first 3 were from other ships, giving the location of icebergs. The other 3 were from the Californian, more concerned with giving her own position, stopped for the night. Those 3 were personally addressed to Captain Smith. It's almost as if Captain Lord was letting Smith know that the Californian was ready and waiting. Captain Smith had delayed turning the corner on the outward southern track. He ordered the turn to the west 10 miles further south than the normal turning point. This was certainly not as an evasive measure to avoid the ice field, but one designed to take him directly into it. He must have known this. It was standard practice of the day for captains to run their ships at full speed through the ice field. Any object large enough to damage an iron steamship would be seen in plenty of time to avoid it. Other ships in the vicinity cruised on at full speed on that night, so in that respect Captain Smith was by no means unique. So why, then, was the Californian stopped? Had she reached her destination and was she now waiting? For the first 40 minutes after the collision, there was really no sense of danger at all. One can understand this frame of mind on the part of the passengers, even on the part of the crew. After all, they thought they were on an unsinkable ship. But for the captain and the officers, who were in full possession of the facts, there is really no excuse. They dithered because they expected to be rescued. It was 35 minutes before the first distress signal was sent. 35 minutes before the first radio emergency, CQD, was sent. 45 minutes before starting the pumps. 45 minutes before starting to prepare the lifeboats. And a full hour and 25 minutes before the first one was launched. When Titanic came to a rest, Captain Smith asked the 4th officer, Joseph Groves Boxall, to work out a position. It is clear from the records that Titanic's navigator worked out a position that was 12 miles away from where they actually were. This was to prove a fatal mistake. We know he was 12 miles out in his calculations because of the actual location of the wreck. The position that Boxall gave would have put the Titanic within sight of the Californian. Was that where he thought he should have been?
So the reason it took people so long to find the wreckage of the Titanic is because the ship was actually found like 12 miles away from where they reported that they were. So their plan was for the Californian to sit out there, and when they were in sight of each other, the Titanic hit this iceberg, starts to sink, Californian can steam over, pick up the passengers, Titanic / the Olympic goes to the bottom of the ocean, they collect the money from the iceberg accident. Everybody survives. Genius insurance fraud scheme.
Win, win, win.
Where it went wrong is the navigator put them at the wrong position. So instead of being within sight, like 12 miles away, or 5 miles away, whatever it was supposed to be, the Californian is actually 19 miles away and can't see him. And the reason that both ships were confused is because there's a ship in the middle of the two that both of the Titanic and the Californian can both see. They mistake this ship for each other. They think, oh great, we're in position, we can see each other. And that's the wrong ship that they're both looking at.
At this point, let's examine what's happened so far. A stricken ocean liner is dead in the water. A rescue ship, the Californian, is standing by. Messages have been sent to Captain Smith from the Californian, stating exactly where she is waiting. Captain Smith can see a stationary ship on the horizon, and having received inaccurate information from 4th Officer Boxall as to his position, He assumes it's the Californian and everything's going according to plan. At about midnight, the Titanic started sending up her distress rockets, red, white, and blue. Rockets could also be seen from the bridge of the Californian, and this was duly reported to Captain Lord. Captain Lord asked what colour the rockets were. In fact, over the next 2 hours, Lord repeatedly asked his officers about the colour of the rockets. Was he expecting to see red or blue signals? Very likely. But whether he was or not, the answer from the bridge was always the same. Only white rockets could be seen. He therefore, rightly, assumed that the rockets were not coming from the Titanic. Survivors reported that the rockets launched from the bridge of the Titanic soared up several hundred feet into the night sky, bursting with an ear-splitting report. The rockets from the ship that was visible from the Californian only went as high as the top of her mast, and even at 4 to 5 miles distant, the officers would have quite reasonably expected to hear a report. But they heard nothing. It seems most likely that the ship seen from the Californian was a wooden sailing bark called the Samson, conducting illegal seal fishing activities on the ice floes at the time. The white rockets she was firing, to mast height only, were intended to recall her small rowing boats. A few months after the disaster, the captain of the Samson said that he had also seen a large liner firing rockets and that he had not gone to investigate because of his own illegal activities. Titanic survivor Miss Edith Russell said the officers told them all, "Don't worry, the Californian will pick everybody up if you don't come back for breakfast." How could they possibly have known it was the Californian? It's hard to believe in such an emergency, but they were letting lifeboats go half full. They knew the ship was sinking, nobody could be that stupid. But they expected the ship on the horizon to come steaming over. But it was the wrong ship. The Californian was 19 miles away, where Captain Stanley Lord waited for coloured rockets. At around 1 a.m. it must finally have dawned on Captain Smith that the rescue upon which the survival of so many depended was not going to materialise. Now boats are being let go full and passengers are beginning to panic. Just before 5:30 on that fateful morning, Captain Stanley Lord woke his radio operator, only to discover that the Titanic had already sunk. He set off at full steam for the wreck site, but of course he was too late. The Carpathia had already arrived and was picking up survivors.
So what the fact checkers have to say about this is that there are several large issues with this theory. First and foremost is that the Californian would be a ridiculous choice as a rescue vessel. Again, just more opinions being dressed up as fact checks. She had a total capacity of 47 passengers and 55 crew members. Again, it's a rescue ship. You don't really need to have like the most comfortable and accommodating quarters to ship these people the last leg of the trip home. I'm sure they would just be ecstatic to be dry and alive. The Titanic was carrying over 2,200 and could have potentially been carrying more than 3,000 if fully occupied. Even if that simple fact is not enough, the other alleged details regarding the Californian are being misrepresented. The ship being ready to steam was simply because they were trapped by ice and the earliest time possible would want to continue their journey. The longer they were at sea, the more money lost. As for both Lord and Smith sleeping fully clothed, that is pure speculation and has little relevance anyways. And actually, I can agree it's pure speculation. I don't know how the people in the documentary know that. My assumption is through the transcripts from the British and the United States inquiries into the disaster, because that's where they got a lot of their other information from testimony from surviving officers. But it wouldn't be of little relevance if it is in the transcripts that was documented. It would be pretty darn relevant and a large coincidence that both captains of these two ships were just taking little naps for the night, fully clothed right off of the main cabin instead of actually going to bed. So it says they were, and considering that they were presumably expecting a sinking, according to this theory, does not account for Lord's inaction. I thought the documentary did a better job of explaining that. Lord's inaction was he was waiting for the colored rockets. He kept asking his crew, because that was supposed to be their signal, the Titanic sending up colored rockets, and that's what Lord's waiting for. And so he and his crew's like, no, those are only white rockets coming from that ship. So that explains his inaction, because he didn't get the signal that he was waiting for. And he was right, it was the wrong ship. Again, it's not proven, it's speculation, but the documentary ties together a lot of information to have a pretty solid basis for that speculation, and for people that purport to be fact checkers to basically just go, that's not good enough to call yourself a fact checker.
Titanic cost $10 million to build, and as a brand new ship would have been insurable for that amount and more. The Olympic, on the other hand, damaged beyond economic repair, would only have been insurable for a much smaller amount. A motive for switching the ships is clear. Normally, White Star Line, when they insured their ships, took on part of the risk themselves, and it was at first thought that Lloyd's of London would only be liable for $7.5 million. Not so. For just 1 week before the maiden voyage of the Titanic, which we now know was in fact the Olympic, White Star Line upped their insurance on the vessel dramatically. And, incredibly, just 5 days after the sinking, Lloyd's paid out $12.5 million.
The claim that the insurance was increased 5 days before the maiden voyage, resulting in a $12.5 million insurance payout. That's the claim. The fact checkers say that the switch theory primarily rests on the alleged premise that the sinking was a deliberate act to recover insurance money to rescue the White Star Line from bankruptcy. However, as already established, the Titanic was, in fact, underinsured by $2.5 million. As if somehow to counteract this fact, it has been alleged that the Titanic's insurance was increased by J.P. Morgan from $5 million to $12.5 million 5 days before her fateful journey. Some go as far as to state that Lloyd's paid out $12.5 million. There's no evidence that the insurance was increased, let alone by more than double its value, which would immediately raise suspicion. Ismay went on public record at the April 1912 United States Senate hearings, and it was also reported in the official public findings that the value of the Titanic was $7.5 million, a figure independently verified by the New York Times and the Spectator, while insured at only $5 million, as reported at the Senate inquiry. If indeed Titanic had been insured at the last minute at $12.5 million, as alleged by conspiracy theorists, this would not have raised serious alarm bells. Would this not have raised serious alarm bells in the minds of the insurers at the time, especially if it was part of the public record that the value was $7.5 million? Quite simply, Titanic was underinsured, the main reason being that the White Star Line actually insured its own ships, and any allegation to the contrary of an increase needs evidence, for which at present there's nothing but unverified speculation. I tried to look for myself to see where the people in this documentary got the number 12.5 million, because the documents that I primarily come up when you start to search for this all say what the fact checkers are saying here. Worth 7.5 million, insured for 5 million. The only thing that I could kind of find about the 12.5 million is that in total that's what the insurance companies paid out, but that includes claims made for, like, property loss and damages paid to the individual passengers as well, not just to the White Star Line. So I'm not sure if that's where the 12.5 million figure came from, or if I just didn't look hard enough into that one. But I guess the reason that I didn't spend a lot of time digging into that is because it's sort of irrelevant to me. Even if it's true that it was only insured for $5 million, I don't need to believe that they increased the insurance amount right before sailing in order for me to think that this is true. I think there's a lot of other evidence from the fact that they just magically changed the design of the ship and it looks exactly like the Olympic, and the whole plan of why the rescue plan with the Californian and the Titanic being found 12 miles away from where they were reported. All of that, honestly, to me, is enough to tip me in the direction that this is true. But to me, it doesn't matter, because if you were in this accident with the British Royal Navy ship and you were deemed at fault, so your insurance is going to pay out $0 on your ship, $5 million is better than zero. So you don't need to be getting $12.5 million. If you just got $5 million back to recoup your losses from this disaster, that would be, in my mind, a pretty strong motive financially. So this is going to be the last clip from the Titanic that I'm going to show you. If true, would be the most damning piece of evidence that this is real, this theory. But again, I don't have the capabilities to go to the bottom of the ocean and fact check this claim for myself. So you just watch.
Although 3/4 of a century at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean did not exactly preserve Titanic in museum-like condition, there is enough left of the wreck to give us more than just an idea of what really happened. Examination of the starboard propeller reveals the number 01 stamped into the metal. In fairness, there is too much corrosion to make out the number 4 clearly, but remember the starboard propeller, numbered 401 for the Titanic, was put on the Olympic as part of the repairs after the collision with the Hawke. Remote cameras under the control of the discoverer of the Titanic wreck, Dr. Robert Ballard, have examined the stern section of the ship. They show that in addition to the lateral bulkheads that were a feature of both the Titanic and the Olympic, there is a longitudinal bulkhead in the stern section where there was none on the original plans for either vessel. The position of this bulkhead suggests a temporary repair has been carried out to strengthen the keel, a keel perhaps damaged by the collision with HMS Hawke. And finally, a close look at the bow could reveal the most damning evidence of all. In 1986, the French National Oceanographic Institute examined the wreck with Dr. Robert Ballard. One of the things they checked was the name of the ship. In keeping with White Star tradition, both ships had their names engraved into the upper bow plates in letters 4 foot high. Examination of the wreck and the name Titanic shows that it is made of iron letters which have been riveted onto the original bow plates. With the passage of time, 2 of the letters have dropped off and been lost forever in the sediment of the seabed. At the place where they once were, engraved into the hull, are the letters M and P.
So then for that final shot where you can see the MP engraved into the ship, the fact checkers just say that that image has been photoshopped. Now, where have I heard that defense before?
You've seen the photo?
I've seen the photograph.
How do you explain that?
I think it's from the investigations that we've done, you can't prove whether or not that photograph is faked or not.
Just to clarify, so you think that photo has been faked?
Nobody can prove whether or not that photograph has been doctored.
So, again, maybe it has been photoshopped, but just the fact checker saying that this is an obviously faked computer-generated image, that doesn't prove that it is either. Now, I know that there are other conspiracy theories about the Titanic wreck, and there's a lot more information in this documentary. Like I said, I think it was like 52 minutes, and I cut it down to just like 15 minutes worth of clips. But one of those other conspiracy theories that I've heard about the Titanic is that, like, J.P. Morgan intentionally orchestrated this sinking because Guggenheim and Strauss and John Jacob Astor were like the 3 richest people at the time, and they were all opposed to the creation of the Federal Reserve and the central banking system, and so J.P. Morgan like orchestrated their deaths to get them out of the way. Just to show that I don't dive into every conspiracy that I hear, I'm not really sold on that particular argument. Not saying that I couldn't be. It just I didn't find a lot of evidence for it online. Seems like two of the guys actually were that they say were in favor of the Federal Reserve, and then the third one never commented on it publicly. So I'm not sure what the evidence people have to suggest that those people were opposed to the creation of the central banking system. So if somebody has that information and they want to send it to me, I would be interested to know where people came up with that one. It's not a huge leap of the imagination for me to believe that JP Morgan is a piece of shit that would probably do something like that. But I would just need to be swayed. I would just need to know more evidence that those people were actually against central banking system. So one of the things that I always consider when I'm evaluating conspiracy theories is what would be people's potential motivations for participating in it or covering it up or lying about it. What would their reasons be behind it, and what would they be getting out of it? So if you're going to look at the motivation of the conspiracy theorists, I don't see any profit or gain that they would be getting by spending their time researching this and putting together these conspiracy theories. I have told every single person I've seen since I've watched this documentary about this conspiracy theory, and only one person knew what I was referring to or talking about. So this isn't widespread. These conspiracy theorists aren't raking in a bunch of money by researching and promoting this. But on the flip side, I initially had some trouble figuring out what would be the reason for people to lie about the sinking of the Titanic, especially after all of these years. What would be their motivation for continuing to cover it up? I mean, nobody could really be held accountable for it at this point. I'm sure the statute of limitations has far surpassed for an insurance fraud claim, and anybody that you would charge is long dead anyways. So what would be the motivation behind keeping this lie going all of these years later? I don't know about everybody else, but in my public school education, we spent a significant amount of time learning about the Titanic. It was in 3rd and 6th grade. We had these like special week or 2-week long segments all about the sinking of the Titanic. I can't really think of like what the historical significance, other than being a disaster, but what the consequences of it afterwards that would deem it such a significant event that we need to spend so much time learning about it. But it's just one of those things that they tell you, these are the facts, this is what happened, and nobody ever really questions it. So after all these years, if they admit that that's something that was in the history books that was presented as fact and they were lying about it, it might make people start to question what other topics have they lied about, and we've just taken the truth for as it's written in the history books for granted and never looked into some of the nitty-gritty details.